Before we start our episode, I wanted to introduce you to the Great War newsletter. Now, the algorithms of the big online platforms make it increasingly difficult for history creators like us to actually reach our community. We've created the newsletter as an easy way to get directly in touch with you instead of paying other companies to do so. Now, the newsletter will inform you about ongoing and new projects, feature links to the latest Great War episodes, including sources, and cool historical stories that we are currently reading about. You can sign up at realtimehistory.net/subscribe. More details are also below this video. And now, on to the show. It's August 1919, and the Russian Civil War has been tearing former Tsarist Empire apart for nearly 2 years. The White Russian army faces a powerful Bolshevik attack in the east, but in the south, the Whites are about to launch one final offensive to reverse the revolution and take back the empire. It's the drive on Moscow. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. By the spring of 1919, the Russian Civil War had been rocking the former empire of the Tsar on an unprecedented scale, pitting multiple factions against each other in a kaleidoscope of violence, hunger, and death. Now, the two largest factions, the revolutionary Bolsheviks and the counter-revolutionary Whites, were both preparing massive military operations to bring a victorious end to the struggle, and the fate of the revolution hung in the balance. Now, before we dive in, if you want more details about the Russian Civil War before spring 1919, or about the Baltic Front in particular, check out our previous episodes on those topics. For today, we're going to concentrate on the Eastern and Southern fronts, where the decisive battles would take place. Now, as a quick faction refresher, the Whites were led by the former officers of the Tsar and wanted to restore the old order minus the monarchy. They held the extremities of the empire in the south, east, and north. Supporting the Whites were the Allies, chiefly Britain, but also France and the United States. Now, the Reds were the revolutionary Bolsheviks and dominated the European heartland of Russia. In the West, there were the various independence movements of smaller nations, like Ukraine, Poland, or the Baltic states. The Greens were peasant armies, which we will cover later, and the Blacks are the faction that we're going to introduce today. The Black faction represents the anarchist peasant army of Nestor Makhno, also known as Makhnovshchina. Now, Makhno was a peasant from the eastern Ukrainian town of Hulyai-Polye, who had spent 7 years in prison for revolutionary activity before 1917. After his release from prison, he returned home fortified with anarchist ideas that he had absorbed from fellow prisoners like Pyotr Ashinov. In the post-revolutionary chaos, he took the lead of a band of armed peasants who seized land from local estate owners, until the Germans and Austro-Hungarians arrived in the spring of 1918. Then he briefly fled to Russia and even met Vladimir Lenin, and though the two differed in political ideology, they agreed to fight the Central Powers and Whites. Makhno then returned to Ukraine and organized local forces against the Austro-Hungarians and the puppet Ukrainian government. Once the Austrians left, Makhno's Black Army fought against the Whites and the independent Ukrainian People's Republic of Simon Petlura. He formally allied himself to the Red Army in February 1919, and by April, he commanded 20,000 men, armed by the Reds. The local peasant leaders were joined by anarchist intellectuals from Russia, like Arshinov and Volin, though the two groups didn't always see eye to eye. Now, in the zone under their control, the anarchists tried to introduce a program of local self-rule, of free peasant councils, giving the land to the peasants, promoting education, and the free exchange of goods and services between the countryside and the city. In political meetings and in the local anarchist newspaper, the Bolsheviks and the Red Terror were openly criticized, and Makhno retained, for the time being, a fair degree of military and political freedom. He felt anarchism was the natural political ideology of the free peasants, as he wrote later. An instinctive anarchism clearly illuminated all the plans of the Ukraine's toiling peasantry, which gave vent to an undisguised hatred of all state authority, a feeling accompanied by a plain ambition to liberate themselves. Now, there have been many different interpretations of Makhno. Some say he was a Ukrainian nationalist, or an anarchist, or the leader of just another peasant jacquerie, or a criminal bandit. Some have questioned to what extent anarchist principles were actually put into practice, or whether his movement was simply a traditional peasant revolt about land reform that needed his military leadership. In any case, in 1919, his standing among local peasants was such that many referred to him as Batka, or Little Father. In the late spring, he controlled a chunk of territory in southeastern Ukraine around Huliai-Polye, though this would soon change. So, now we've refreshed our grasp of the various factions at war in the summer of 1919, let's turn to the action at the front. Let's start in the east, where the white forces of Supreme Leader Kolchak stood tantalizingly close to the Russian heartland after a partially successful offensive in March and April. They'd been stopped just short of their goal of reaching the Volga River, but Kolchak was hoping that his advance would spur the peasants to rebel against the Reds, and cause the Allies in Paris to recognize him as the legitimate leader of Russia. In fact, it was to win Allied favor that he had rushed the start of the offensive, and now his army was overstretched and vulnerable. Now, the spring attack had been a major gamble, since his forces faced some serious problems. For one thing, the white troops were mostly inexperienced. Of his 150,000 men, 2/3 were poorly trained recent conscripts, and only 5% of his officers had received proper pre-war training. Now, the army was also inefficient and corrupt, in spite of the large amount of weapons and supplies it received from the Allies. General Gaida's Siberian army, for example, was drawing rations for 275,000 troops, even though he only had 30,000 men under his command. Now, British goods and weapons often never made it to the fighting units. Instead, they were diverted and sold on the black market, brought over to the Reds by deserters, or simply held up by inadequate transport infrastructure. The British General Knox, in charge of overseeing Allied military support to the Whites in the East, had been furious when the first Red Army soldiers he saw were wearing fresh new British uniforms. Legend has it that the Reds even sent him a joking letter thanking him for supplying the Red Army. Now, what supplies did arrive took over a month to make the journey from far-off Vladivostok, and had to cross territory controlled by peasant rebels and Cossack warlords, since Kolchak's authority essentially stopped at Lake Baikal. Now, white officers themselves knew their position was fragile. As one put it, "Don't think that our successful advances are a result of military prowess, for it is much simpler than that. When they run away, we advance. When we run away, they will advance." But it wasn't just the white military in the East that was weak. White civilian legitimacy was also lacking. Now, Kolchak had hoped that as he approached the center of Russia, the large population of peasants would rally to the white cause. This did not happen, because many of them feared the return of the landowners and factory bosses if the whites won. Now, Kolchak's statement on land reform in April rang hollow and was not enough to win peasant hearts and minds. One officer later wrote of this failure, "We not only did not give the muzhik the bird in the hand, we were even afraid to promise him the bird in the bush." Now, though it's been argued he held some progressive views, many in his regime were reactionary, and the peasants and ethnic minorities knew it. Kolchak's own General Budberg wrote in his diary, "The regime was only form without content. The ministries can be compared to huge and imposing windmills, busily turning their sails, but with no millstones inside, and with much of their machinery broken or missing." Meanwhile, the Red Army facing Kolchak was growing in strength. Reinforcements were moved east, a luxury it could afford since it had far larger reserves than any of the white armies. The young but talented General Frunze also arrived, along with future Marshal Tukhachevsky, who spent some time as a prisoner of war in Germany alongside Charles de Gaulle. And with these fresh forces, the Bolshevik counterattack began at the end of April and pushed back the overextended forces of the Whites. Ethnic Bashkir units deserted Kolchak and went over to the Red Army, further weakening white resistance. Now, despite the progress, in May, Lenin was still worried about the situation, given the strength of the Whites in the south. "If before winter we do not make the Urals, I consider that the defeat of the revolution will be inevitable." As it turned out, he had no reason to worry. Ufa, at the edge of the Urals, was taken on June 9th, partially thanks to the efforts of Commander Vasily Chapayev, who was made into a Soviet hero for his part in the war before he was killed in September. Now, the Siberian army under General Gaida, which had continued to advance in May, was now forced to retreat because of the collapse of the center. The rout was on, and by the end of June, Red forces reached Perm, the starting point of the White offensive back in March. Now, at this stage, the Bolsheviks had a choice to make. They'd won a great victory, but had also stretched their supply lines. Red Army Commander-in-Chief Valsetis and War Commissar Leon Trotsky wanted to call a halt and consolidate their gains. But Lenin, Stalin and General Kamenev, the top commander in the east, wanted to press on, and they got their way. Kamenev took over the command of the army, Vatsitis ended up in prison, and the offensive continued across the mountains. By mid-July, the Bolsheviks were in Yekaterinburg, following an advance of up to 300 kilometers in 4 weeks. By July 24th, Chelyabinsk had fallen, despite a major White counterattack. Now this counterattack used up the last few fresh troops the Whites had, and though they inflicted 15,000 casualties on the Reds to their own 5,000, the Red Army could not be stopped. The fleeing White Army, with its bloated complement of staff officers and families and servants in tow, was described by one of its own officers. These were not military units, but some kind of Tatar horde. Kolchak himself summed up the reasons for White failures in July: poor supply, poor relations between officers and men, effective Bolshevik propaganda, and ineffective White propaganda. Now, to make matters worse for Kolchak, in July, Allied representatives came to Omsk to discuss how they could help the White regime. Instead, the White defeats convinced the Allies that Kolchak's government was a lost cause, and further help was likely useless. The British withdrew their training mission in late summer, and General Knox wrote to the White government. At present, all seems to me to be absolute chaos, and worse chaos than anything I have seen in the past 12 months. It is my wish to help you, but frankly at present you make help impossible. Now the loss of the Urals was decisive. Not only did the British lose faith in Kolchak, but the mines and factories in the region were among the few that the Whites had. Plus, it cut off the Central White armies from their southern forces. Now by mid-August the Red Army had reached the Tabol River, and the White Army was a shadow of its former self, with no reserves left to replace battle casualties or deserters. Kolchak attempted a last, desperate counterattack in September, but the gains were soon lost and the isolated Southern Cossack army surrendered. His main force had shrunk from 62,000 men to just 15,000, mostly because of desertion. And as the summer turned to early fall, the White regime in the east was in full retreat. The army had been smashed, and the authorities were in no position to organize a recovery. General Budberg summed it up: in the army disorganization, at the Stavka illiteracy and harebrained schemes, in the government moral decay, discord, and the dominance of the ambitious and egotistical, in the country uprisings and anarchy, in society panic, selfishness, graft, and all kinds of loathsomeness. At the top thrive various scoundrels and adventurers. Where will we get to with such baggage? So, the summer campaign in the east had resulted in a major Bolshevik victory and pushed the Kolchak regime to the brink of collapse, causing the Allies to withdraw their support. But the Allied disengagement in summer of 1919 was not just about Kolchak. It had been months in the making. Back in March, Red Army General Vatsitis had expressed the Bolshevik fear of Allied power. So everything depends on whether the Entente wants to come in actively against us or, for various reasons of internal and external policy, does not. But even as he was uttering these words, Allied policy in Russia was about to fall apart. The French and Greeks had pulled out of Ukraine in April, and the Americans had decided to pull out of North Russia in May. France began to shift to a diplomatic policy of strengthening the newly independent countries in Eastern Europe to contain Bolshevik Russia with a so-called cordon sanitaire. Now even the British, up until now the most dedicated interventionists, were ready to go. Trotsky commented on the Allies' pending abandonment of the Whites. "We have before us a case of betrayal of the minor brigands by the major ones." But that didn't mean it was easy to go. David Lloyd George, who had always had doubts about intervention, admitted as much. Bolshevism threatened to impose, by force of arms, its domination on those populations that had revolted against it, and that were organized at our request. If we, as soon as they had served our purpose, and as soon as they had taken all the risks, had said, "Thank you, we are exceedingly obliged to you. You have served your purpose. We need you no longer. Now, let the Bolsheviks cut your throats." We should have been mean. We should have been thoroughly unworthy indeed of any great land. But leave they would, in spite of a few last-gasp efforts. In May, The Allies gave partial diplomatic recognition to Kolchak, just as his armies were being defeated. The same month, they tried to attack Petrograd along with the Whites, but were also defeated. The summer saw the last offensive action in North Russia as well, as a covering action for the evacuation at Arhangelsk. Now, only in the Far East did a significant Allied presence remain, and it could not influence the outcome of the war. By June, Trotsky knew the jig was up, and the Allies had no stomach for a fight. German and Austro-Hungarian militarism has been smashed to pieces. French and English militarism still exists outwardly, but it is inwardly rotten and incapable of fighting. Neither America nor England, and still less France, is in a position to send a single corps to Russian territory for the struggle with Soviet power. The Allies were all but out. But it wasn't only Allied withdrawals and white weakness that had begun to turn the tide of the war. The Bolsheviks were also hard at work behind the front, organizing, planning, and propagandizing to strengthen their hold on power. Now, the Reds knew if they were going to overcome the Allied-supplied forces of the Whites, reform was needed. They were cut off from most of the world, and from their potential allies in Hungary, Slovakia, and Bavaria, so they would have to survive on their own. Now, the economic situation in the Red Zone was still incredibly difficult, and the Red Terror against the peasants continued, although the authorities did reduce the violence and pressure somewhat. Now, defense production was concentrated in a few areas at the expense of the rest, according to the new principle of udarnost, or shock production. This allowed the Bolsheviks to overcome the serious ammunition shortfall of 50 million rounds a month by July. Now, the Reds also tried to reform the army. Former Tsarist officers were given more power, and political commissars a bit less. More of the critical junior commanders were trained, and more men were conscripted, bringing the total strength of the Red Army up to 1.5 million men by mid-1919. Now, desertion was still a major problem, but hundreds of thousands of deserters also returned to the ranks of an army that had become more traditional in its culture. Now, as Lenin had said in March, "Iron discipline is needed here, and if you say that this is an autocratic feudal system and protest against saluting, then you will not get an army in which the middle peasant will fight." Though he'd lost some influence after the June disagreement with Lenin and Stalin, Trotsky also took steps to keep up morale and motivate the troops. He flew around the front in a special armored train, making 36 visits to the troops and covering 120,000 kilometers. As he wrote later in his memoirs, "The strongest cement in the new army was the ideas of the October Revolution, and the train supplied the front with this cement." Now, the improved quality and morale of the Red troops was not lost on their opponents. General Budberg confided to his diary in August, "We are up against not the bolos and motley Red Guard rabble of last year, but a regular Red Army." So the Red Army and Bolshevik government were slowly reforming and gaining the upper hand over the chaos in the center of Russia, while the Whites in the east were collapsing. Now came the sternest test for the revolution from the White armies in the south. In the south, General Denikin's armed forces of South Russia spent the spring consolidating its newly won base in the Caucasus and licking its wounds after a defeat on the Don. But the Red Army was in no mood for rest and attacked in the Donbass and Don regions in March and April, making good progress before being stopped. Now, due to the harsh policies directed against the local population, in March a major revolt broke out behind Red lines amongst the Cossacks, which was supported by airdrops of supplies from British planes. At the same time, the Red Army advanced in central Ukraine, crushing the forces of the Ukrainian People's Republic, pushing out the French and Greek intervention forces, and occupying the Crimea. In May, Trotsky was ready for a final reckoning. "This spring and this summer, we must finish with the Southern Front once and for all." But despite his public bluster, Trotsky was well aware of the difficult conditions facing the Red Army. After visiting the front in May, he wrote, "The prevailing state of chaos, irresponsibility, laxity, and separatism exceeds the most pessimistic expectations." Later that summer, he shared his concerns with the Central Committee. "Nowhere do the soldiers suffer so much from hunger as in the Ukraine. Between a third and a half of the men are without boots or undergarments and go about in rags. Everyone in Ukraine, except our soldiers, has a rifle and ammunition. Now, it may be that he was exaggerating to force the government to send more supplies, but the situation was indeed serious, and hundreds of thousands deserted the Red Army that year. Indeed, the tables were about to be turned on the Red Army. By May, the Reds had about 230,000 troops in the south, some of whom had been transferred from the relatively quiet Polish front, while the Whites had only about 50,000. But though they were outnumbered, the White troops in the south, unlike in the east, were still of better quality than their Red opponents, which they were about to prove. The first White blow fell to the west, in the direction of southern Ukraine. General Shkurov's troops quickly took the Crimea, as well as the Donbass. Kharkiv was taken in June, and the experienced Whites had beaten Makhno's anarchist peasants on their own turf, and the Black Army withdrew westwards across the Dnieper and accepted an offer of alliance from another peasant leader, Nikifor Grigoriev. The Bolsheviks accused the Black Army of treason, and fighting broke out between the former allies. Makhno then had Grigoriev shot shortly thereafter upon learning his new ally was planning to join the Whites, or in order to take over his units, depending on whom you believe. Now in the east, Wrangel's Caucasian army finally took the besieged city of Tsaritsyn on the Volga, which had been under pressure for so long it had become known as the Red Verdun, and 40,000 prisoners were taken. On July 3rd, Denikin held a victory parade and issued the famous Moscow Directive, which announced an offensive aimed at the occupation of the heart of Russia, Moscow. Now, according to the directive, Wrangel's forces were to follow the Volga north to Saratov and then wheel west, passing through Nizhny Novgorod before attacking Moscow. In the center, the volunteer army was to advance north through Kursk, Oryol, and Tula, while the Don army was to advance along the axis of Voronezh and Ryazan. This plan was a huge risk. The White armies were suffering from weak discipline and morale, and the supply situation was catastrophic. Now, some observers have argued that Denikin was foolish to go for Moscow at this stage, including his own General Wrangel, who criticized his superior in his memoirs after the war. But others say that he had no choice, that the Red Army's numbers, quality, and armament would only continue to increase. If there was a chance for the Whites to overturn the revolution, Denikin had to seize it now. And by the summer, Allied aid had also begun to arrive at the port of Novorossiysk, including 60 British tanks and 168 British planes, complete with crews. Lenin sensed the gravity of the moment. Now the foreign capitalists are making a desperate effort to restore the yoke of capital through the attack of Denikin, whom they have supplied, even more than Kolchak, with officers, supplies, shells, and tanks. But the White offensives that began after the Moscow Directive weren't directed at Moscow at all. Instead, White forces acting without orders from Denikin struck hard to the west, again in Ukraine. They took Poltava by the end of July and had occupied Mykolaiv, Odessa, and Kiev by the end of August. Makhno's Black Army, fighting both Whites and Reds, took refuge around the city of Uman to regroup. They agreed to a truce with Petlura and began to integrate Red deserters into their ranks. Now the Central Front was a mess, as Red Army attacks in August delayed the launch of the White Drive on Moscow and pushed the Volunteer Army back to Kupiansk. At the same time, White Cossack cavalry under General Mamontov launched a wild raid behind enemy lines. They ran unchecked for a month, sowing chaos and damaging Red lines of communication and supply. They took Tambov on August 18th, where they nearly captured Trotsky himself. In early September, they were in Voronezh. Now, during the wild ride, the Whites looted and plundered, to the extent that some soldiers simply decided to desert and go home with the spoils. Trotsky called the Mamontov raid a comet with a filthy tale of robbery and rape. On the Volga, Wrangel's army set out in July and made it to within 100 kilometers of Saratov by August. But he was stopped by a Red Army reinforced by troops freed up from the Red victories in the east and a lack of White supplies and reinforcements. Near Lake Elton, a few White patrols actually met up with some of Kolchak's cavalry that had been cut off by the Red advance in the Urals, but the contact was fleeting. By the end of August, the Caucasian army had retreated to its starting point in Tsaritsyn. Now the main White offensive finally got going in the second half of September. though by now Kolchak was long beaten in Siberia and Wrangel had already failed on the Volga. It was one last desperate gamble for the fate of the country. The Volunteer Army's elite units led the charge and captured Kursk with the help of armoured trains on September 20th. The Dawn Army then captured Voronezh on September 30th. The Red Army was in full retreat, and many soldiers deserted in the face of the White advance. Nikita Khrushchev, the future leader of the Soviet Union, experienced the rout firsthand as a battalion commissar in the shattered 9th Division. Aryol fell on October 14th, and the White armies were within reach of the all-important arms factories at Tula and, 300 kilometers away from where they now stood, Moscow itself. A British military mission report made a bold prediction. In the face of resistance, judging from the progress hitherto made, Moscow might be reached within 2.5 months. But despite the impressive progress of the White armies, there were worrying signs. On September 25th, Makhno's regrouped troops destroyed Denikin's units in western Ukraine at the Battle of Peregonovka. The Black Army raced eastwards, soon reaching its capital of Hulaypolye and threatening White supply lines for the advance on Moscow. Denikin was forced to transfer some units to the south to deal with Makhno. But this was not Denikin's only problem. His army's advance was chaotic and the command structure was weak. The awful supply situation meant they had to live off the land, which in practice meant stealing from the local population. His forces also committed pogroms against the local Jewish population. Now the Whites hoped that the people would rise up and join them, but this did not happen, and they did not have enough troops to properly hold on to the wide front they now held. In September, Denikin complained to General Maevsky. This gloomy picture of grandiose looting and plunder, the bacchanalia of arbitrary rule, which reigns unchecked in the whole frontline zone. So by the early fall of 1919, the Red Army stood triumphant in the east, with the remnants of Kolchak's armies in full retreat. The Allies were withdrawing from the north, east and south, and had lost the will to continue the intervention. The last hope of the Whites to stem the tide of Bolshevik revolution were Denikin's armies on the road to Moscow. But their strength was on the wane, and in the heart of the Soviet zone, the Red Army was marshalling its forces for a counteroffensive that would decide the fate of the revolution. Now, as usual, you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description. And if you want to support our channel, you can help us on Patreon, or you can buy our official merchandise, like our newly released Hope 1919 design, which is an excellent conversation starter for all the history parties you attend. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel that would really love a ride in a Tachanka in 1919.